They say down in Carolina, there was once a man so strong the masters feared to look him in the eye. His name was Solomon Reed, a blacksmith born in chains, with hands that could bend iron and a heart that refused to bow. The overseer, Caleb Crenshaw, called him the Giant and swore he'd break him for sport. But when the whip came down, Solomon didn't scream. He snapped the chain, grabbed the man who beat him, and broke him like the tool he'd become. They locked him in the stockade, brought a slave breaker from Charleston, and promised the world he'd never rise again. But a storm was brewing, one forged in blood, iron, and silence, because what they didn't understand was simple. When you try to break a man who's already given everything, you don't destroy him. You build his revenge. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Dawn broke over Ward Plantation like a whisper. Mist hugged the ground, turning the fields into a sea of gray. The only sound that cut through the morning silence was the steady rhythm of metal striking metal. Clang, clang, clang. Solomon Reed stood at his forge, his massive frame silhouetted against the orange glow of the fire. At 7 feet tall, he towered over every man on the plantation, slave or free. His shoulders were as wide as an ox yoke, his arms thick as fence posts. But it was his hands that drew the eye, enormous yet precise as they shaped the glowing iron against the anvil. Clang, clang, clang. Each strike was measured, each blow exactly where it needed to be. The same way Solomon moved through life, with purpose, with control. "Solomon," came a soft voice from behind him. He turned to see Ruth, his wife of 5 years, approaching with a small cloth bundle. She was a slender woman with kind eyes that somehow remained bright, despite everything they had witnessed. Her faded blue dress had been patched so many times it told its own history of hardship. "Brought you something to eat," she said, unwrapping a piece of cornbread. She offered him a tin cup of water, too. "You left before I could get it to you." Solomon nodded his thanks, setting down his hammer. His hands dwarfed the cornbread, but he took small, careful bites. Every morsel mattered when you never got enough. "Mornin', Solomon!" "Mornin', Miss Ruth!" Josiah called out, racing toward the forge. The boy was all knees and elbows, moving like he had extra joints. At 12 years old, he'd been orphaned when his mother died of fever 2 winters back. Solomon and Ruth had taken him in as their own, though no papers would ever recognize such bonds. "Boy, you're making enough noise to wake the dead," Ruth scolded, but her eyes were smiling. "Sorry," Josiah whispered dramatically. He grabbed the long-handled fan and began pumping it, sending air through the coals. The embers brightened, dancing with new life. "Master wants new hinges for the smokehouse door by noon," Josiah reported. "Overseer Crenshaw told me to tell you. Said he'd be by to check." Solomon nodded, his face giving nothing away. He finished his cornbread in silence. Ruth touched his arm. "I've got to get to the big house. Mrs. wants her linens washed before the guests arrive." "Guests?" Solomon asked, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Some planters from Charleston way," Ruth said quietly. "Mr. Ward wants to show off the plantation." Solomon's jaw tightened slightly. He knew what that meant. As if summoned by their words, the sound of hoofbeats approached. Overseer Caleb Crenshaw rode into view on his chestnut mare, a riding crop slapping against his boot. "Ain't paying you to stand around socializing," Crenshaw called out. He was a wiry man with a face perpetually reddened by sun and whiskey. The leather vest he wore creaked as he dismounted, tobacco juice staining his beard as he spat. "Get on to the house, woman," he barked at Ruth. She lowered her eyes. "Yes, sir." With one last glance at Solomon, she hurried away. Crenshaw circled Solomon, looking him up and down like he was appraising livestock. "Got some important men coming today. They'll want to see the Giant of Carolina at work." He smirked. You're going to show them what 7 feet of slave muscle can do." Solomon stared straight ahead, his face a mask. "You hear me, boy?" Crenshaw demanded. "Yes, sir," Solomon replied, his voice flat. "Good. I want this place spotless. And you," Crenshaw jabbed a finger at Josiah, "you make sure those coals stay hot and stay out of the way." He leaned in closer to Solomon. "You'll lift whatever I tell you to lift. You'll hammer whatever I tell you to hammer. These men pay good money to see a giant at work." By midday, 3 carriages rolled up the main drive. Mr. Ward himself led 5 well-dressed planters toward the forge. They fanned themselves with straw hats, commenting on the heat as they approached. "And here," Ward announced proudly, "is the crown jewel of my blacksmithing operation. Solomon here stands 7 feet, if he's an inch." The men murmured, circling Solomon like he was a curiosity in a traveling show. "Make that horseshoe, boy," Crenshaw ordered. "Show these gentlemen your craft." Solomon worked the iron, his movements precise despite the eyes upon him. The planters watched, fascinated. "Pick up that wagon axle," Crenshaw commanded next, pointing to a heavy iron shaft. Solomon lifted the axle, the chains still attached, clanking against the metal. The weight was tremendous, but he held it steady, muscles straining. "Amazing," one planter remarked, "like watching an ox with hands." "He's quite the investment," Ward boasted, "worth 3 normal field hands." A thin man with a silver-tipped cane chuckled. "I dare say, Crenshaw, the slave works harder and stands taller than his master." Laughter rippled through the group. Crenshaw's face flushed crimson. His eyes narrowed at Solomon, as if the blacksmith had somehow caused this humiliation. "Put it down," he snapped. Solomon lowered the axle carefully. Something in the overseer's eyes made him wary. "Quite the beast you have there," the thin planter remarked. "But I prefer my property with less thinking behind the eyes. Too much height makes them forget their place." Ward quickly steered the conversation elsewhere, leading the men toward the cotton fields. Crenshaw lingered, his gaze burning into Solomon. "Get back to work," he muttered, before storming after the group. That evening, as lanterns flickered in the slave quarters, Ruth peeled potatoes while Solomon sat on their small porch. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "Miss Abigail told me while I was pressing linens. Said they laughed right in Crenshaw's face." Solomon remained silent. "He was drinking in the cookhouse after," she continued. "Mary heard him ranting about putting the beast in his place." She set down the knife and moved to sit beside him. Her small hand found his massive one. "Solomon, please, just keep your head down for a while. You know how Crenshaw gets when his pride is hurt." Solomon looked down at their intertwined fingers, hers slender and nimble, his large and calloused. "The man can't break what he can't reach," he said quietly. Ruth's eyes clouded with worry. At the forge, the last embers faded from bright orange to dull red. Solomon stared into the dying fire, seeing shapes in the coals, chains, shackles, faces. In the distance, thunder rolled across the sky, the sound vibrating in his chest. The thunder seemed to speak, its voice a warning only Solomon could understand. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Ward Plantation. A crowd had gathered in the main yard, plantation owners and their wives, fanning themselves beneath parasols, their fine clothes stark against the dusty ground. Servants moved among them with trays of lemonade and whiskey, their eyes downcast. Caleb Crenshaw stood in the center of it all, chest puffed out like a rooster. He'd spent the morning arranging what he called a demonstration of strength, though everyone knew it was really a show of power. His power. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crenshaw called out, tipping his hat, "Master Ward has graciously allowed me to present something special today. A display of brute strength you won't see anywhere else in Carolina." At the edge of the crowd, Ruth watched with her hands clasped tightly at her waist. Beside her, Josiah shifted from foot to foot, eyes wide with worry. "They gonna make him do something bad?" the boy whispered. Ruth squeezed his shoulder. "Just watch and be still," she murmured. But her own heart hammered against her ribs. Solomon emerged from the direction of the forge, his expression calm, though his eyes missed nothing. He wore no shirt, only worn canvas trousers. The muscles of his chest and back rippled as he walked, causing several ladies to whisper behind their fans. "There he is," Crenshaw announced. "The Giant of Carolina." Solomon stopped where Crenshaw pointed, his face a mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Now then," the overseer continued, gesturing toward a wagon half buried in mud at the edge of the yard. One wheel had sunk deep, the axle nearly touching the ground. Yesterday's rain has created quite the challenge. 4 mules couldn't pull this supply wagon free. He snapped his fingers, and 2 field hands brought forward a heavy chain with a harness of sorts. "Solomon here is going to do what beasts of burden could not," Crenshaw said, grinning at the crowd. The field hands fitted the harness across Solomon's massive shoulders and chest. The chain links were thick as a man's thumb, the metal cold against his skin. Crenshaw circled him, making a show of checking the arrangement. "Too tight?" he asked quietly. Just for Solomon's ears, as he yanked the chain harder than necessary. "Good." Ruth's fingers dug into Josiah's shoulder as the boy tried to step forward. "No," she whispered. "You can't help him now." The crowd murmured with anticipation as Solomon was positioned before the wagon. The chain stretched from his harness to the front axle, heavy links dragging in the dirt. "Begin!" Crenshaw shouted. Solomon leaned forward, letting the harness take his weight. The chain grew taut, biting into his shoulders. The wagon didn't move. "Put your back into it, boy," Crenshaw called out, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Solomon closed his eyes for a moment. He took a deep breath, then opened them again. Something shifted in his gaze, a hardening, a focus. He dug his bare feet into the mud and pulled. The chain creaked. The wagon groaned. A muscle in Solomon's neck bulged like rope. "Look at that power," someone whispered. Sweat poured down Solomon's face and chest as he strained against the impossible weight. The chain cut deeper into his flesh. Still, the wagon remained stuck. Crenshaw's smile began to fade. "I said, pull." Solomon's jaw clenched. He gathered himself, knees bent, and heaved with everything he had. A low sound escaped him, not quite a growl, not quite a groan. The wagon lurched. The buried wheel turned an inch, then another. Mud sucked and squelched. The crowd gasped. With agonizing slowness, the wagon began to move. Inch by inch, Solomon dragged it forward. The veins in his arms stood out like rivers on a map. His feet slid in the mud, but he kept pulling, kept moving. And then, with a great wet sound, the wheel pulled free. The wagon rolled forward, suddenly light, nearly knocking Solomon off his feet with the change in resistance. The crowd erupted in applause. Women clapped gloved hands together while men nodded in appreciation. Someone called out, "Remarkable." Solomon stood straight, breathing hard. Blood trickled from where the chain had cut into his shoulder, but his face remained impassive. Crenshaw stepped forward, his smile tight and false. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we manage difficult tasks here at Ward Plantation." He turned to Solomon. "Bow to the fine folk," he ordered. Solomon hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Crenshaw's face darkened. "I said bow!" The silence stretched for another second. Then, slowly, Solomon began to bend at the waist. But before he could complete the motion, Crenshaw's boot shot out, catching him in the ribs just as he was off balance. Solomon stumbled to one knee. "That's better," Crenshaw spat. "On your knees is where you belong." The laughter and chatter stopped instantly. The crowd went still. Even the birds seemed to quiet. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. Beside her, Josiah made a small, angry sound. Solomon looked up at Crenshaw, their eyes meeting for just a moment. Something passed between them. A promise, perhaps, or a warning. Then Solomon lowered his gaze and rose to his feet once more. "Take the chains off him," Mr. Ward called suddenly from the edge of the crowd. "The demonstration is over." Refreshments await on the veranda. Later, in their small cabin, Ruth dabbed a wet cloth against the raw marks on Solomon's shoulders. The single oil lamp cast long shadows across the dirt floor. "Hold still," she murmured. "These cuts are deep." Solomon sat on their only chair, his massive frame making it look like a child's seat. He didn't flinch as she cleaned his wounds. Josiah sat cross-legged on the floor, watching with solemn eyes. "I wanted to help you," the boy said. "When he kicked you, I wanted to—" "No," Solomon interrupted, his deep voice quiet but firm. "Never put yourself in harm's way for me." "But you're strong," Josiah insisted. "You could have picked him up with one hand if you wanted." Solomon looked at the boy, his expression softening slightly. "Strength ain't for show," he said. "It's for surviving." Ruth pressed her lips together as she applied a poultice of herbs to the worst of the cuts. "Crenshaw was in a rage after. Mary from the kitchen heard him cursing your name." Solomon nodded slowly. "He means to break me." "Then bend," Ruth whispered fiercely. "Just bend. Please." Across the plantation, in the overseer's quarters, Caleb Crenshaw sat alone. A bottle of whiskey stood half-empty on the table beside him. In his lap lay his bullwhip, its leather worn smooth from use. He ran the whip through a cloth soaked in oil, his movements methodical despite his drunkenness. The leather gleamed in the lamplight. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the empty room, "we'll see what breaks first, the chain or the man." Outside, a full moon climbed high in the sky, casting silver light across the silent fields. In the distance, dogs barked at shadows, restless, uneasy. The air hung hot and still around the slave quarters, as if the world itself were holding its breath. No breeze stirred the leaves, no cloud crossed the moon. The night waited, patient and watchful, for what morning would bring. Morning came with a blood-red sunrise. The rooster had barely finished crowing when Crenshaw's whistle pierced the air. 3 sharp blasts that meant everyone was to gather. Immediately. Solomon stood in the doorway of their cabin, buttoning his worn shirt with careful fingers. Ruth came up behind him, her hand light on his back. "What does he want now?" she whispered. "Whatever it is," Solomon answered. "It ain't good." They joined the stream of people hurrying toward the main yard. Mothers carried babies, children clutched at skirts, and men walked with eyes forward, faces carefully blank. The entire plantation, field hands, house servants, cooks, laundresses, all moved like a solemn procession. Josiah appeared beside them, breathless. "Mr. Crenshaw has the whip," he said in a low voice. "And there's guards with guns." Solomon nodded once. He squeezed Ruth's hand, then let it go. In the yard, Crenshaw stood before the whipping post, a thick wooden beam sunk deep in the ground, stained dark with years of blood and suffering. 2 plantation guards flanked him, rifles in hand. At their feet lay chains and a coiled bullwhip. "Line up!" Crenshaw barked. "Everyone where I can see you." The crowd arranged itself in rows, the tallest at the back, children at the front. Solomon stood head and shoulders above everyone else. There was no hiding. "Yesterday," Crenshaw began, pacing slowly before them, "one of your own showed disrespect in front of Master Ward's guests." His eyes found Solomon in the crowd. "Step forward, giant." Solomon moved forward with measured steps. The crowd parted silently before him. "No!" Ruth broke from the line, rushing after him. "Please, Mr. Crenshaw. He didn't mean no disrespect." 2 guards intercepted her, catching her arms. She struggled against them, tears streaming down her face. "Solomon." Solomon didn't turn. His eyes remained on Crenshaw, who smiled like a cat watching a wounded bird. "Your woman begs prettily," Crenshaw said, loud enough for all to hear. "But some lessons can't be avoided." He gestured to the post. "Shirt off, face the wood." Solomon unbuttoned his shirt with the same deliberate care he'd shown when putting it on. He folded it neatly and handed it to a guard, who threw it in the dirt. Then he turned to the post, standing with his back exposed, his forehead resting against the rough wood. "Chain him," Crenshaw ordered. Guards moved forward with heavy iron manacles. They secured Solomon's wrists to metal rings embedded in the post, pulling the chains tight so he stood stretched tall, unable to move. Crenshaw uncoiled his whip, 9 feet of braided leather, tipped with a piece of wire that would tear flesh to the bone. He let it trail in the dirt as he walked a slow circle around Solomon. "The charge is defiance," he announced. "The sentence is 20 lashes." A murmur ran through the crowd. 20 lashes had killed men before. Smaller, weaker men than Solomon, but still. "Count them," Crenshaw said, stepping back. The whip whistled through the air. It cracked against Solomon's broad back with a sound like a gunshot. A line of red appeared instantly, blood welling up and running down in a thin stream. Solomon didn't make a sound. "1," Crenshaw counted himself when no one else spoke. The second stroke crossed the first. The third landed lower. By the 5th, Solomon's back was a crisscross of bleeding cuts. Still, he made no sound. Not a grunt, not a whimper. The crowd watched in horrified silence. Children buried their faces in their mothers' skirts. Men clenched their jaws, their own backs straightening as if they could share the burden. Ruth had stopped struggling. She stood limp between the guards, her face wet with tears, watching each stroke with flinching eyes. 10, Crenshaw counted, breathing heavily now. Solomon's hands were white-knuckled on the chains, but he hadn't sagged against them. He stood straight, his forehead still pressed to the post, his breath coming in controlled, even measures. Crenshaw paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Still standing proud?" he said, voice pitched for all to hear. "Let's see how you feel at 20. He put more force into the next blow. The whip cut deeper, tearing a strip of skin away entirely. Blood spattered the ground at Solomon's feet. By 15, Crenshaw was panting with effort. His face had gone red, his eyes wild with something beyond anger, something like fear. Because Solomon still hadn't made a sound. "Why won't you break?" Crenshaw snarled, bringing the whip down again. 17, 18, 19. Solomon's back was a ruin of flesh and blood, but his legs hadn't buckled, his shoulders hadn't slumped. Crenshaw stepped closer, speaking directly into Solomon's ear. "You'll die before you ever stand above me." Then he stepped back for the final blow. The whip rose and fell one last time. Something changed in Solomon's stance. A tremor ran through his massive frame. And then, from deep in his chest, came a sound. Not human, not animal, but something ancient and terrible. A roar that shook the very air. With a sharp crack, the chains securing his wrists snapped. Links scattered across the dirt like hailstones. Solomon turned. Crenshaw stood frozen, the whip limp in his hand, his mouth open in shock. In 2 strides, Solomon closed the distance between them. His hand, massive, powerful, closed around Crenshaw's throat. He lifted the overseer clean off the ground, as easily as picking up a doll. "No more," Solomon said, his voice low and terrible. Then he slammed Crenshaw into the earth with such force that the sound of breaking bones carried across the yard. Crenshaw's ribs and collarbone shattered on impact. He lay broken in the dirt, blood bubbling from his lips, eyes wide with disbelief. A guard rushed forward, rifle raised. Without turning, Solomon swung his arm. The broken shackle, still attached to his wrist by a few links of chain, caught the man squarely in the temple with a sickening crunch. The guard dropped, his skull caved in, dead before he hit the ground. Panic erupted. White women screamed. Men shouted orders. The enslaved scattered, some running for the cabins, others standing rooted in shock. Through it all, Solomon stood unmoving, blood running down his back, the broken chains hanging from his wrists like strange ornaments. The main house door slammed open. Master Thomas Ward stormed out onto the porch, his face twisted with rage and fear. In his hand gleamed a silver pistol. "What in God's name?" he began, then stopped short at the sight of Crenshaw writhing on the ground and the dead guard beside him. Solomon turned toward Ruth, who stood trembling, freed by guards who had more urgent concerns. He walked to her slowly, then sank to his knees before her. "I won't run," he said softly, his eyes holding hers. "Let them see what they've made." "Solomon," she whispered, reaching for him. Before their fingers could touch, guards fell upon him like wolves. Rifle butts crashed against his head and shoulders. Boots kicked at his sides. Still, he made no move to fight back. He had done what he needed to do. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Ruth's face, streaked with tears but fierce with pride. They dragged his unconscious body across the yard, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. The heavy door of the stockade, a small building of thick logs with no windows, swung open. They threw him inside and slammed the door shut. The lock clanged into place just as thunder cracked overhead, as if the sky itself were responding to what it had witnessed. The candles flickered in the main house as midnight approached. Rain pattered against the windows, a steady drumbeat in the darkness. Inside the master bedroom, Caleb Crenshaw lay on a feather mattress, his chest wrapped tight with linen bandages that couldn't fully hide the purple-black bruising beneath. Each shallow breath sent pain shooting through his broken ribs. Master Thomas Ward paced at the foot of the bed, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. His normally neat appearance had given way to a loosened collar and hair standing on end from repeated frustrated tugs. "This is unprecedented," Ward muttered, taking another swallow. "Absolutely unprecedented." His wife, Margaret, sat rigid in a chair by the door, her face pale beneath her nightcap. What if they all rise up? What if they're planning something right now? Her voice quavered. "We could be murdered in our beds." "They won't," Ward snapped, but his eyes darted to the window anyway. The plantation house sat dark and isolated amid the storms. Suddenly, it felt very vulnerable. Crenshaw tried to speak, each word a painful effort. "The giant must be made example." Blood flecked his lips. "Or they'll all think." "Quiet," Ward ordered. "Save your strength." He drained his glass and set it down with a sharp click. "This isn't just about one slave anymore. It's about control, about order." Margaret twisted her handkerchief between her fingers. "Perhaps if we sold him? Sent him south to the sugar plantations?" Ward shook his head. "And have everyone know a Ward slave broke his chains and attacked an overseer? We'd be laughingstocks. No one would respect our authority again." He straightened his shoulders. "No, there's only one solution." He crossed to the writing desk and pulled out paper and pen. The scratching of his quill filled the room as he wrote quickly, decisively. When finished, he folded the letter and sealed it with wax. "Thomas?" Margaret questioned. "I'm sending for Ezekiel Crane," Ward said flatly. Crenshaw's eyes widened. Even Margaret gasped. "The slave breaker? From Charleston? But his methods are so—" She couldn't finish. "Effective," Ward completed. "His methods are effective, and that's what matters now." He rang for a house slave, who appeared moments later, blinking sleep from his eyes. "Wake Simmons. Tell him to take our fastest horse to Charleston. This letter goes directly to Ezekiel Crane. No delays." The slave bowed, eyes carefully downcast, and hurried away. "One way or another," Ward said, staring out at the rain, "the giant will be broken." A full week passed. The plantation existed in an uneasy hush. Solomon remained in the stockade, a wooden prison barely tall enough for him to sit upright, with no light except what filtered through cracks between logs. On the seventh day, hoofbeats approached up the main road. A tall figure on horseback appeared through the morning mist, riding slowly, deliberately, as if measuring each step. Ezekiel Crane dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to a waiting stable boy without acknowledging him. He stood nearly as tall as Solomon, but half as wide, all bone and sinew, dressed in black from his boots to his wide-brimmed hat. His face was pale as chalk, with deep-set eyes that seemed never to blink. Ward greeted him on the porch steps. "Mr. Crane? Thank you for coming." Crane inclined his head slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and precise. "Show me the slave." They walked to the stockade in silence. Ward ordered the guards to unlock it. The heavy door swung open, releasing the stench of blood and human waste. Inside, Solomon sat with his back against the wall, legs drawn up awkwardly in the small space. His wounds had crusted over, but his eyes were clear and alert. Crane stepped forward, examining Solomon as one might inspect livestock. His gaze traveled from Solomon's face to his shoulders, down to his hands. He circled the small prison, looking at him from every angle. "Stand," he ordered. Solomon didn't move. Crane nodded, as if this confirmed something. "He's not broken," he said to Ward. "He's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Ward asked. Crane's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "For me, it seems." He turned away from the stockade. "Chain him in the forge, ankles and wrists. I'll begin tomorrow." "The forge?" Ward frowned. "But that's where he—" "Precisely," Crane interrupted. "A man's strength becomes his weakness when properly leveraged. His forge will become his prison." By nightfall, Solomon was secured inside the blacksmith shop. Heavy chains bound his ankles to an iron ring in the floor. Similar chains restricted his wrists, allowing just enough movement to work the bellows and hammer, but not to reach the door. Crane stood over him, a leather crop tapping against his palm. "You will work," he said simply. "You will make what I tell you to make. You will receive food and water when I decide you deserve them." Solomon's eyes met his, unwavering. "Others before you thought themselves strong," Crane continued. "They all learned differently." He leaned closer. "I never fail, Giant. Remember that, in the days ahead." He left, locking the door behind him. Solomon remained alone in the darkness, the cooling forge casting faint red shadows across the walls. Hours passed. Sometime near midnight, a soft scratching came at the back wall of the forge. A loose plank shifted, and Ruth's face appeared in the narrow gap. "Solomon?" she whispered. He moved as far as his chains allowed. "Ruth, you shouldn't be here. It's dangerous." "Had to see you." She pushed a small bundle through the opening, cornbread wrapped in a cloth, and a water skin. "Eat quick. Guards check every hour." Behind her, Josiah's small face appeared. "I'm keeping watch, Mr. Solomon," the boy whispered. "Nobody sees us." Solomon took the food with grateful hands. "They've brought in a breaker," he said between bites. "Ezekiel Crane." Ruth's face paled. "I heard the house slaves talking. They say he—" She couldn't finish. "I know what they say." Solomon drank from the water skin, the cool liquid easing his parched throat. "But listen, whatever happens, you stay clear. Both of you. Don't risk yourselves." "We can bring food," Josiah insisted. "And messages. I'm fast and quiet." Ruth nodded. "The boy's right. We won't abandon you." A dog barked in the distance. Josiah tensed. "Someone's coming." "Go," Solomon urged. "Now." Ruth reached through the gap, her fingers just brushing his. "Stay strong," she whispered. Then they were gone, the plank sliding back into place just as footsteps approached outside. The next morning, Crane returned before dawn. He brought a bucket of cold water, which he threw over Solomon without warning. "Begin work," he ordered, pointing to a pile of iron. "Make nails, 100 before noon." So began the breaking. Crane forced Solomon to work without rest, without proper food or water. The forge grew hotter as the day progressed, sweat pouring from Solomon's body. Still, he worked. His hammer rose and fell, each strike precise, despite his thirst and hunger. When evening came, Crane inspected the nails. "Too few," he announced, though Solomon had made the 100 required. "No food tonight." This pattern continued for days. Work demands increased, while rewards decreased. Other slaves were brought to witness Solomon's punishment, to see the giant humbled, to learn that resistance led only to suffering. Yet each night, Ruth and Josiah came. They brought scraps of food, sips of water, whispered encouragements. Josiah carried messages between Solomon and others in the quarters, small acts of defiance that kept hope alive. On the 6th night, Crane told Ward, "Give me another week. When I'm through, he'll crawl like a dog." Ward nodded grimly, relieved that the plantation had remained quiet. That order seemed to be returning. Later that night, as Crane left the forge, lightning flashed behind him, illuminating his thin silhouette in the doorway. Thunder followed, rolling across the sky like distant drums. Inside the darkened forge, Solomon gripped his hammer so tight his knuckles bled. But his eyes, reflecting the last embers of the dying fire, remained unbroken. Rain drummed on the forge roof like angry fingers, the sound both soothing and maddening. Solomon's muscles burned as he worked the bellows. 3 days without proper rest had left him hollow-eyed, but his movements remained precise. The chains at his ankles rattled with each step as he moved between the anvil and the fire. Crane watched from a dry corner, occasionally flicking water at Solomon's bare back, where whip marks were still healing. "Faster," he ordered, his voice flat. Solomon said nothing. He pumped the bellows harder, making the coals glow bright orange. Sweat mixed with rainwater on his skin, dripping onto the hot metal with tiny hisses. A shadow moved near the back wall. Josiah slipped in through a gap where 2 planks had warped from years of heat. The boy was soaked to the bone but moved like a ghost, quiet and careful. He caught Solomon's eye and held a finger to his lips. Crane turned away to inspect the horseshoes Solomon had finished. In that brief moment, Josiah darted forward and slid a soaking wet rag across the dirt floor. Solomon's foot moved to cover it, just as Crane looked back. "These edges are rough," Crane said, tossing a horseshoe onto the floor. "Do it again." Solomon nodded once and bent to retrieve the rejected work. As he did, his fingers found the wet rag. He squeezed it discreetly, letting precious water drip into his mouth. The coolness was heaven after hours of forge heat. Josiah was gone before Crane noticed anything, vanishing through the gap like morning mist. By midday, the rain had stopped, but the ground had turned to thick mud. Crane unlocked Solomon's ankle chains but kept his wrists bound. "Follow me," he ordered. Solomon stepped outside, blinking in the sudden brightness. The open air felt strange after days in the forge. He noticed other slaves watching him from the fields, their eyes careful not to linger too long. Crane led him past the cabins to a far corner of the plantation where the cemetery lay. 2 fresh holes gaped in the wet earth. Beside them, wrapped in rough cloth, lay 2 bodies. 2 field hands tried to run last night, Crane explained casually. "The dogs found them." Solomon stared at the bundles. One was small, likely a boy no older than 15. "Bury them," Crane said, handing him a shovel. "Deep enough that the animals won't dig them up." Solomon took the shovel, his chained hands making the work awkward. The wet earth stuck to the blade, heavy as lead. Each shovelful seemed to take all his remaining strength, but he worked steadily, silently. "You know," Crane said, watching him struggle, "your wife came to me yesterday." Solomon's hands tightened on the shovel. Begged me to go easier on you. Said you were a good man. Said you didn't deserve this. Crane smiled thinly. Pretty woman. Soft-spoken. Mr. Ward's been considering moving her to the main house, as a personal servant. Solomon's jaw tightened, but he kept digging. You could make things easier for her, Crane continued. For yourself, too. All you need to do is submit. Acknowledge your place. Solomon drove the shovel into the mud with such force that it stood upright when he released it. He looked at Crane directly, his voice rough from disuse. I know my place, he said quietly, between your cruelty and their lives. Crane's crop lashed out, striking Solomon across the face. Your place is wherever we put you, giant. Remember that. Solomon touched his bleeding lip and returned to digging, his shoulders hunched against more blows. Under his breath, he whispered words that might have been prayers, but they sounded half like curses. Lord, judge between me and them. Lord, remember their sins. Word spread through the quarters. Solomon Reed, the giant, was still standing after a week under Crane's hand. The whispers grew as night fell. Crane strung up Turner last year. Man died after 3 days. The giant ain't breaking. It's like he's made of iron himself. Maybe he made a deal with the devil. Or maybe God won't let him die. An old woman nodded slowly. That's it. He's the man God won't kill. The name stuck, passing from cabin to cabin as the sun set. The next morning, Crane tried a new approach. He had Solomon chained upside down from a beam in the forge, blood rushing to his head. The position was agonizing after only minutes. Solomon had been hanging for 2 hours. All you need to say is, Master, I submit, Crane explained, circling him. Then this ends. You go back to work. Life continues. Solomon's face had turned deep red, veins bulging at his temples. Still, his eyes remained clear, watching Crane with unnerving focus. Master, I submit, Crane repeated slowly. 4 simple words. Solomon's lips parted. Crane leaned closer. To God alone, Solomon whispered. Crane's face hardened. Another day, then. He walked out, leaving Solomon hanging. From behind a woodpile, Josiah watched with wide eyes. The other slaves had told him Solomon must be broken by now. But what Josiah saw wasn't brokenness. It was something else entirely. Something sharp and focused, like a blade being tempered. That night, Ruth came again to the loose plank. Solomon lay on the dirt floor, barely able to move after being cut down. Solomon, she whispered urgently, they're saying terrible things, that you're planning something, that you'll get us all killed. He crawled closer to her voice. I'm just trying to survive. I know what surviving looks like, Ruth said, reaching through to touch his face. This is something else. I see it in your eyes. Her voice broke. Don't let hate take you. Please. There's got to be another way. Solomon was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. Hate's the only thing they've left me with. Ruth pulled her hand back as if burned. That's not true. You have me. You have our people. You have your faith. Faith? Solomon laughed bitterly. What has faith given me but the strength to endure more torture? It's given you a soul they can't touch, Ruth insisted. Don't let them take that too. Footsteps approached. Ruth vanished, pulling the plank closed behind her. Solomon rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling. His fingers found something he'd hidden beneath his thin bedding. A nail he'd forged in secret, its point sharpened when Crane wasn't watching. Small, but deadly if used right. His first weapon. Outside, the rain began again, falling harder now. The sound of water extinguishing the forge's outer coals hissed through the night, like the sound of resolve hardening into something darker. 2 days later, the sky cleared to a hard, bright blue. Solomon's body was a map of pain. Welts from the whip, burns from the forge, bruises from the chains. Yet he stood tall as Crane ordered all the slaves to gather in the main yard. The sun beat down mercilessly as 40 men, women, and children formed a circle. Their faces showed a mix of fear and exhaustion. Some avoided looking at Solomon altogether, as if his suffering might be catching. Others stared openly, wondering how he still stood. Ruth took her place near the front, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. Josiah fidgeted beside her, his thin frame tensed like he might bolt at any moment. The boy's gaze darted between Solomon and Crane, measuring the distance between predator and prey. Master Ward sat on the porch, fanning himself lazily as Crane stepped into the center of the circle. The slave breaker wore a clean white shirt despite the heat, looking more like a preacher than a torturer. "Today," Crane announced, his voice carrying across the yard, "we have a lesson about pride." He gestured to Solomon, who stood with his head unbowed despite the chains at his wrists and ankles. "This man thought himself above his station," Crane continued. "He believed his strength made him special. But there is nothing special about a slave except his obedience." Ruth's fingers twisted in her apron. Josiah's breath came quick and shallow. "Step forward," Crane ordered Solomon. Solomon moved slowly, chains rattling with each step. He towered over Crane, but the difference in power between them was clear to everyone watching. "Now," Crane said, smiling thinly, "you will kneel and beg forgiveness for your pride." Solomon stood motionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the plantation's boundaries. "Kneel," Crane repeated, his voice harder. The slaves watched in tense silence. A few glanced nervously toward the house, where Ward had leaned forward in his chair. "I said kneel!" Crane's voice cracked like a whip. Solomon remained standing, a mountain refusing to bow to the wind. Crane's smile disappeared. He nodded to 2 guards who stepped forward with clubs raised. "Perhaps you need more persuasion, Solomon." Ruth's voice cut through the tension, barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the yard. "Please." Solomon's eyes found hers. Something passed between them. A conversation, without words. "For me," she pleaded. "Don't make me watch them hurt you again." Josiah looked between them, confused by the surrender he saw forming in Solomon's face. Slowly, agonizingly, Solomon's massive frame began to bend. His knees touched the dirt. His head lowered. The sight of the giant on his knees sent a visible shock through the gathered slaves. Some looked away in shame, others in relief. "That's better," Crane said, circling him like a vulture. "Now beg for forgiveness." Solomon's voice came rough and low. "I ask forgiveness." "Louder," Crane demanded, "so all can hear your shame." "I ask forgiveness," Solomon repeated, each word seemingly pulled from his throat with hooks. Ruth's tears flowed freely now. Josiah's hands had curled into small, useless fists. Crane smiled broadly and turned to address the crowd. "This is what happens to pride. It breaks, always." He looked to Ward. "And now, as promised, the reward for submission." Ward nodded, a bored gesture of approval. From his pocket, Crane withdrew a folded paper and held it high. "This man has learned his lesson, and so I offer mercy. Not for him," he smiled cruelly at Solomon, "but for his wife." Ruth's head snapped up, confusion replacing sorrow. "This paper," Crane continued, "is a freedom pass. Ruth Reed will be transported north to live as a free woman." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ruth staggered as if struck. "What? Your husband's submission has purchased your freedom," Crane explained. "A generous act from Master Ward." Ruth looked wildly from Crane to Solomon, who remained kneeling, head bowed. "Step forward," Crane ordered her. She moved hesitantly, disbelief written across her face. "Thank your master," Crane instructed. Ruth bobbed an awkward curtsy toward the porch. "Thank you, Master Ward. Thank you." Her voice broke as she turned toward Solomon. Guards blocked her path when she tried to approach him. "No farewells," Crane said. The wagon leaves now. But, Ruth protested. Now, Crane repeated, or the offer is withdrawn. Ruth's eyes met Solomon's one last time. Stay alive, she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. I'll find a way back to you. 2 guards took her arms and led her toward a waiting wagon near the gate. Josiah moved to follow, but was shoved back by another guard. The gathered slaves watched in stunned silence as Ruth was helped onto the wagon. The driver cracked his whip, and the horses pulled forward. Ruth's face, a mixture of hope and devastation, grew smaller as the wagon rumbled down the long drive toward the main road. Solomon remained kneeling in the dirt long after she had disappeared from sight. Hours passed. Solomon had been returned to the forge, his momentary obedience rewarded with extra water and a crust of bread. The bread remained untouched. His hands moved mechanically, hammering iron into horseshoes, while his mind replayed Ruth's final words. Outside, voices drifted through the open door. 2 guards taking a break from the afternoon heat. Crane sure knows how to break 'em, one said, chuckling. Did you see the giant's face when they took his woman? Smart move, the other agreed. Anderson's plantation needed kitchen help, and they paid good money for her. Solomon's hammer paused mid-strike. Should have seen Crane practicing that speech. Freedom pass, the first guard mimicked. Like any niggers getting free on Ward's watch. Their laughter faded as they walked away, unaware that Solomon had heard every word. The hammer came down with such force that the iron split in 2. Solomon stared at the broken metal, something shifting behind his eyes, the last embers of hope extinguished, replaced by a cold, consuming fire. Night fell. The forge went dark. Solomon lay on the dirt floor, eyes open in the blackness. His fingers moved slowly, methodically, carving a symbol into the packed earth with a piece of charcoal from the fire. The shape formed gradually, a hammer, its head surrounded by flames. The mark of a blacksmith transformed into something more, a symbol of vengeance. Josiah appeared at the loose plank, his small face ghostly in the darkness. Solomon? You awake? Solomon didn't answer. His fingers continued their work, deepening the lines of the burning hammer in the dirt. I heard what they did, Josiah whispered. About Miss Ruth. They lied. Yes, Solomon said finally, his voice strange and hollow. They lied. He sat up slowly, his massive frame a shadow in the darkness. His eyes turned toward the horizon, the direction the wagon had taken Ruth. They'll see the fire she left in me, he whispered. Josiah saw the mark Solomon had carved and shivered, suddenly afraid, not of Solomon, but of what was coming. The boy had never seen such coldness in the giant's eyes before. It was like looking at a different man entirely. Morning came with a hazy yellow light. The sun struggled to pierce the fog that clung to the fields of Ward Plantation like a shroud. In the main house, Ezekiel Crane sat at breakfast, cutting his ham with precise movements. The door to the dining room opened, and a house slave entered. Sir, there's someone to see you. Says it's urgent. Crane dabbed his mouth with a napkin. Who? Field hand named Abel, sir. Crane nodded. Send him round back. Minutes later, Crane stood on the back porch. Below him, shifting from foot to foot, stood Abel, a gaunt, nervous man with eyes that never settled in one place. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his hands trembled slightly. Speak, Crane commanded. Abel swallowed hard. It's about Solomon, sir. What about him? He's making something in the forge. At night, when the guards ain't watching close. I seen him hiding things under his sleeping mat. Crane's eyes narrowed. What things? Metal things, sir. Sharp. Like weapons. Abel's voice dropped to a whisper. And he's been talking to the others, when you ain't around, about rising up. Crane studied the man before him. And you're telling me this because? Abel's eyes darted around, making sure no one else could hear. You promised. Last week. Said, if I helped keep the peace, you'd see I got better treatment. Maybe even papers someday. A cold smile crossed Crane's face. You did right to tell me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin. Here, get yourself some extra food. Abel took the coin, relief washing over his features. Thank you, sir. Thank you. As the man scurried away, Crane's smile disappeared. He turned and barked at the nearest guard. Get 4 men. Meet me at the forge. The sound of boots approaching made Solomon look up from his work. He carefully slid the small metal pick he'd been sharpening into the folds of his shirt. But it was too late. Crane burst through the door, 4 armed guards behind him. His eyes locked onto Solomon's. Search him, Crane ordered, and tear apart that sleeping area. The guards rushed forward. Solomon didn't resist as rough hands patted him down. One guard found the sharpened pick and held it up. What's this? Crane asked, taking the improvised weapon. Solomon said nothing. Another guard called out from the corner where Solomon slept. Found more, sir. He held up 3 small, sharp pieces of metal. Crane's face darkened. He stepped close to Solomon, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think your little rebellion would work? Solomon's expression remained blank, but his eyes burned with quiet hatred. Bring him, Crane ordered. Everyone needs to see what happens to those who don't learn. The guards dragged Solomon from the forge. Word spread quickly across the plantation. Field hands were ordered to stop working. House slaves were brought outside. Within minutes, nearly every slave on the Ward plantation stood in the main yard. In the center, Crane waited. Behind him, 2 guards had brought a large wooden cross, laying it flat on the ground. Others dug a hole several feet deep. Josiah pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his thin face rigid with fear. His eyes searched for Abel, spotting him standing apart from the others, staring at the ground. Master Ward emerged from the house, taking a seat on the porch to watch. Beside him sat a recovering Crenshaw, his face still bruised but his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Crane raised his hands for silence. This beast, he announced, pointing at Solomon, thinks himself above us all. He thinks he can plot against his masters. He thinks he's God's hammer. Crane held up one of the metal picks. But today, we'll see if God will lift him down. He nodded to the guards. They forced Solomon to lie on the wooden cross, stretching his arms along the crossbeam. No! Josiah shouted, but a slave woman quickly pulled him back, covering his mouth. Crane picked up a hammer and a long iron nail. He placed the nail against Solomon's right wrist, right where the chains had cut into his flesh for weeks. This is mercy, Crane said, loud enough for all to hear. I could have you whipped to death. Instead, I'll let God decide if you deserve to live. The hammer came down. The sound of metal driving through flesh and into wood echoed across the yard. Solomon's body arched in agony, but no sound escaped his lips. Another nail, another blow. Solomon's left wrist secured to the wood. Women in the crowd began to wail. Men looked away. Josiah's small body shook with silent sobs. Crane stepped back, surveying his work. Raise him up! 6 guards struggled to lift the cross. It rose slowly, with Solomon's massive frame weighing it down. With a final heave, they dropped it into the prepared hole. The cross settled with a thud that seemed to shake the earth itself. Solomon hung there, blood running down his arms, his feet barely touching the ground. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes remained open, fixed on something beyond the plantation. Crane turned to the gathered slaves. This is what defiance brings. Remember it. The crowd began to disperse, some crying, others moving with the numb steps of those who had seen too much horror. Josiah remained, staring up at Solomon's suspended form. When the boy tried to approach with a water gourd hidden under his shirt, a guard spotted him. The blow caught Josiah across the face, sending him sprawling in the dirt. No comfort for the condemned, the guard sneered. From the porch, Crane watched with satisfaction. He turned to Ward and Crenshaw. "When the crows take his eyes," he said, pointing to Solomon's hanging form, "they'll see who rules this land." The day dragged on. Solomon hung between earth and sky, each breath a torment. The sun beat down mercilessly, then began its slow descent. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon. In his moments of clarity, Solomon's thoughts turned to Ruth. Where was she now? Did she know what had become of him? The pain would subside, and memory would flood in. Ruth's smile, her voice, her touch. Then the agony would return, and with it, a rage that burned hotter than the forge. Darkness fell. The first rumble of thunder rolled across the fields. Crane stood before the cross one last time, looking up at Solomon's still form. The giant's head hung forward, his body limp. "It seems God has made his decision," Crane said to the guard beside him. "Cut him down in the morning. Let the others bury what's left." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the yard in harsh, white light. Crane turned and walked back to the house, sure his work was done. Behind him, fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning the ground to mud. From the shadows near the slave quarters, Josiah watched the overseer leave. When the yard was empty, he crept forward through the rain, crawling the last few yards on his belly to avoid being seen. The mud soaked through his clothes as he reached the base of the cross. He pulled himself up to his knees, reaching as high as his small frame would allow. His fingers barely brushed against Solomon's dangling hand. "Solomon?" he whispered, voice cracking. "Can you hear me?" No response. Rain washed the blood from Solomon's wrists in thin rivulets that ran down his arms. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. In its brief illumination, Josiah saw Solomon's face, eyes closed, features slack. "Dead," he thought with a stab of despair. "I'm sorry," Josiah whispered, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I'm so sorry." He pressed his forehead against Solomon's hand in a final gesture of respect. And then, a twitch, so slight he might have imagined it. Josiah froze. Another flash of lightning revealed Solomon's fingers, curling weakly around his own. The giant lived. Lightning cracked the sky open as Josiah ran through the rain. His small feet slipped in the mud, but he pushed forward, heart pounding in his chest. He had to find help, and fast. At the edge of the slave quarters, Samuel and Isaac huddled beneath the shelter of an old oak. Samuel, tall and lean, with a face marked by years of suffering, spotted the boy first. "What you doing out here, child?" Samuel grabbed Josiah's arm, pulling him under the tree. "The storm's got teeth tonight." "It's Solomon!" Josiah gasped, water streaming down his face. "He's alive! The giant's alive!" Isaac, older with a permanent limp from an overseer's whip years back, exchanged a skeptical glance with Samuel. "Boy, we all saw what Crane did." "I touched his hand," Josiah insisted. "He grabbed mine back. Please, we gotta get him down." Samuel shook his head. "They'd kill us all for helping him." "They're gonna kill him anyway," Josiah's voice cracked. "And they're all inside 'cause of the storm. Nobody's watching." The men hesitated. Then Isaac spoke softly. "If he's truly alive, it's a sign." Thunder boomed overhead, as if in agreement. "Show us," Samuel finally said. The three figures moved through the darkness like shadows, the storm covering their approach. When they reached the cross, Samuel climbed on Isaac's shoulders, pressing his fingers to Solomon's neck. "Lord, have mercy," Samuel whispered. "There's life in him yet." Working quickly, Samuel used a metal spike Josiah had hidden in his clothes to pry at the nails. Each one came free with a sickening sound, releasing Solomon's massive weight. The men struggled to lower him without dropping his broken body. "The old forge shed," Isaac whispered. "In the woods. Nobody goes there no more." Together, they half dragged, half carried Solomon through the rain. The abandoned blacksmith shed stood nearly hidden among the trees, a quarter-mile from the plantation buildings. Built years ago before the main forge was constructed, it had been forgotten by most. Inside, rotting boards kept out some of the rain. The men laid Solomon on a pile of old sacks. His breathing came shallow, but steady. "I got this from the kitchen." Josiah pulled a small flask from inside his shirt. "Cook's whiskey." Samuel took it, pouring the amber liquid over Solomon's torn wrists. The giant's body tensed, but he made no sound. Isaac tore strips from his own shirt, wrapping them tightly around the wounds. "It ain't much, but it might keep the rot out." "I'll stay with him," Josiah offered. Samuel shook his head. "You need to go back before they miss you. They'll be looking for someone to blame if they find him gone." "But listen to me, boy." Samuel gripped Josiah's shoulders. "You go back. Act normal. Then tomorrow, you can sneak out to check on him. Bring water if you can." Reluctantly, Josiah nodded. He cast one last look at Solomon's still form before disappearing into the rain. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the old shed. Solomon's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. His cracked lips formed a single word: fire. Josiah, who had returned before sunrise with a jug of water and a piece of cornbread, leaned forward. "Solomon, can you hear me?" The giant's eyes cleared, fixing on the boy's face. "Water," he rasped. Josiah helped lift his head, letting him drink slowly. When Solomon had taken his fill, he tried to sit up, grimacing in pain. "Easy," Isaac said, steadying him. "You've been through hell itself." "Where's Ruth?" Solomon asked, his voice stronger. The men exchanged uncomfortable looks. "Crane sold her to Wilkinson's plantation," Josiah admitted quietly. "I heard the guards talking. They never meant to free her." Solomon closed his eyes, a muscle working in his jaw. When he opened them again, something had changed. The quiet dignity that had always defined him was still there, but now it shared space with something darker. "They tried to crucify me," he said slowly, "like they did the Lord. But I ain't done yet." Over the next 2 days, Solomon recovered with surprising speed. His massive frame, weakened by torture and exposure, gradually regained its strength. Josiah worked as his eyes and ears, sneaking back and forth from the plantation with food and news. "They're looking for you," the boy reported on the evening of the second day. "Crane's furious. He's whipping anyone who looks at him wrong." Solomon nodded, flexing his bandaged hands. Though still raw, they could grip again. "What about the big house? Master Ward's having another dinner party tonight. Celebrating some deal with a cotton buyer from Charleston." A slow smile spread across Solomon's face. "Good. When men feast, they don't expect war." That afternoon, Samuel and Isaac brought 3 more trusted men to the shed. Together, under Solomon's direction, they began transforming farm tools into weapons of vengeance. Pitchfork tines became deadly spears. Scythe blades were broken down and attached to wooden handles as curved knives. Hoe heads were sharpened to wicked edges. "We need to get to the forge," Solomon told them, his voice steady and cold. "There's oil there. Gunpowder from Ward's hunting supplies. I hid some beneath the floorboards before Crane found me out." Josiah volunteered again. "I can slip in after dark. Nobody watches the forge at night now that you're gone." Solomon looked at the boy with a mixture of pride and concern. "Be careful. If they catch you, they won't," Josiah said with quiet confidence. That night, while laughter echoed from the big house, Josiah crept to the forge. He filled small bags with the hidden gunpowder and took a flask of oil, hiding everything beneath grain sacks in a wheelbarrow. The journey back to the shed seemed to take forever, each sound in the darkness making his heart stop. When he finally delivered his bounty, Solomon clasped his shoulder. "You've got the heart of a grown man, Josiah." The sun rose twice and fell twice, and each time the giant grew stronger. By the 4th day after his crucifixion, Solomon stood at his full height once more. The wounds in his wrists would never fully heal, but he could hold a hammer again. And that was enough. On the evening of that fourth day, Solomon stepped outside the shed, breathing deeply of the night air. In the distance, the lights of the big house glowed warmly. The sound of violin music and laughter drifted through the trees. Another celebration. Samuel joined him, handing him one of the makeshift weapons, a hammerhead attached to a short handle. Solomon's fingers closed around it naturally, as if the metal recognized its master. "Are we ready?" Samuel asked quietly. Solomon's eyes never left the distant lights. "We are. Tonight, we take back what's ours." Josiah stepped out behind them carrying a torch. "The others are ready too." Solomon nodded, looking toward the house where his tormentors dined in comfort. Let their feast be their funeral. Night fell like a cloak over Ward Plantation. The storm that had been threatening all day finally unleashed its fury, sending sheets of rain cascading from the heavens. Lightning split the darkness, followed by rolling thunder that shook the ground. Solomon stood at the edge of the trees, rain streaming down his massive frame. His wounds still ached, but pain was an old friend now. Behind him gathered 7 men, Samuel, Isaac, and others who had suffered under Ward's ownership. Their faces were grim, determined. Each clutched a makeshift weapon. "Remember," Solomon said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "The guards first, then the horses, then we bring the fire." The men nodded. No one spoke of fear, though it lived in their eyes. They'd crossed a line from which there was no return. From the doorway of the old shed, Josiah watched them prepare. The boy had begged to join them, but Solomon had refused. "You stay here," Solomon had told him firmly. "Someone needs to tell our story. Someone needs to live." Now Josiah huddled in the shadows, his thin arms wrapped around his knees, watching the men he'd come to see as family disappear into the night. The plantation slept uneasily under the storm's assault. 2 guards huddled beneath the stable overhang, seeking shelter from the downpour. They complained about their lot, cursing Crane for posting them outside on such a night. "What's he think gonna happen?" one grumbled. "That giant's dead and rotting somewhere." The words were still hanging in the air when a blade sliced through the darkness, catching the first guard across the throat. He fell without a sound. The second guard reached for his pistol, but Samuel was faster. A sharpened hoe head plunged into his chest, driving him backward into the mud. Isaac and 2 others moved swiftly into the stables. The horses sensed their urgency, stamping nervously as the men cut their tethers and drove them out into the storm. The animals bolted, disappearing into the night, taking with them any chance of quick pursuit. Solomon moved like a shadow toward the forge. The building stood dark and silent, waiting for a smith who would never return to work its fires again. He carried with him a torch wrapped in oiled cloth, protected from the rain. Behind the forge sat the barrels Josiah had filled, oil and gunpowder, a deadly combination. With methodical precision, Solomon positioned the barrels against the wooden walls. He unwrapped the torch and struck flint against steel. The skills of his trade now turned to destruction. Sparks caught the oiled cloth, and flames leapt to life, dancing in the rain. Solomon touched the torch to each barrel, then hurled it through the forge window. He turned and ran, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. The explosion shattered the night. A ball of flame erupted, sending burning timbers shooting skyward. The force knocked Solomon forward, but he kept his footing, massive legs pumping as he raced toward the main house. Inside the plantation house, Caleb Crenshaw jerked awake at the sound. His broken ribs screamed in protest as he sat up, confusion giving way to terror when he saw the orange glow through his window. From his bed, he could see the forge consumed in flames, burning despite the rain. "No," he whispered, reaching for the pistol beside his bed. "No, no, no." Upstairs, Ezekiel Crane had been studying maps when the explosion rocked the house. He grabbed his sword and rushed to the window, his eyes widening at the destruction below. Slaves were running in all directions. Guards lay motionless on the ground. And through the curtain of rain and smoke, massive figures moved with purpose. Impossible, he breathed. Crane raced down the stairs, shouting for the house servants. "Arm yourselves! They're attacking." But his commands fell on empty rooms. The house slaves had already fled. He burst through the front door onto the porch, sword raised, rain pelting his face. "Fight, you cowards!" he screamed at the remaining guards, but they were already dead or fleeing into the night. A massive figure emerged through the firelight. Solomon Reed walked slowly up the path to the house, his silhouette demonic against the burning forge. Blood streamed from his reopened wounds, mixing with rain and mud, but he seemed not to notice. His eyes fixed on Crane with terrible purpose. Crane's composure cracked. He slashed wildly with his sword, cutting the air between them. "Back! Get back, you devil!" Solomon never slowed. When the blade swung again, he caught it in his bare hand. Blood poured between his fingers, but his grip was iron. The sword bent, then snapped. "You can't kill what you already crucified," Solomon growled, his voice rumbling like the thunder overhead. Terror dawned in Crane's eyes as Solomon lifted him bodily from the ground. With a roar that rose above the storm, Solomon hurled the slave breaker through the air. Crane's scream cut short as he crashed through the burning forge wall. Flames engulfed him instantly, his thrashing visible for only moments before the roof collapsed. Inside the house, Crenshaw heard Crane's scream. His hands shook as he aimed his pistol at the doorway, waiting. A floorboard creaked. He fired wildly, the shot going wide. The gun clicked empty on his second attempt. Solomon ducked through the doorway, his massive frame filling it completely. Rain and blood dripped from his body onto the polished floor. He limped forward, each step deliberate. "Please," Crenshaw whimpered, shrinking back against his headboard. "Have mercy." Solomon's laugh was hollow. Mercy. He reached the bed in 2 strides, his massive hand closing around Crenshaw's throat. "You tried to break me. Now feel what you built." With terrifying ease, his hand tightened, crushing Crenshaw's chest. The overseer's eyes bulged, his feet kicking uselessly against the sheets. Then he went still. Upstairs, Thomas Ward frantically stuffed ledgers and money into a leather satchel. The sounds of death from below drove him to panic. He ran for the back stairs, clutching his wealth to his chest. The roof groaned above him. Burning timbers from the forge had set the house alight, and flames were spreading with unnatural speed. Ward reached the staircase just as the ceiling gave way. Burning debris crashed down, engulfing him in flames. His scream pierced the night briefly, then faded beneath the storm's roar. Outside, Solomon stepped back onto the porch. Behind him, the plantation house was fully ablaze, orange flames licking hungrily at the white columns. The symbol of his oppression was being devoured by the very element he had mastered. He found Ward's account ledger on the porch where the master had dropped it in his flight. The book that had recorded the price of human beings, the cost of whips, the profit of stolen labor. Solomon tossed it into the fire, watching as the pages curled and blackened. The enslaved people of Ward Plantation gathered in the yard, their faces illuminated by the burning house. Some wept with fear, others with a terrible joy. All looked to Solomon, waiting. But the giant of Carolina had finished his work. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the swamp, rain hissing as it struck his skin. Blood trailed behind him, marking his path. Josiah pushed through the crowd, watching Solomon's retreat. "Where's he going?" someone asked. "To find Ruth," Josiah answered, his voice steady despite his tears. They stood there in the rain, watching as the massive figure grew smaller, then disappeared into the darkness of the swamp. Behind them, everything that had been their prison collapsed in flames. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to witness what remained. Thin wisps of smoke drifted over the blackened ruins of Ward Plantation, rising like ghosts into the dawn sky. The main house was nothing but charred timbers and collapsed walls. The forge, Solomon's prison and workshop, stood half-destroyed, its stone foundation the only part that had survived the flames. Josiah moved among the gathered slaves, his small shoulders somehow straighter than the day before. Despite his youth, the others looked to him now. He had been closest to Solomon. He knew the giant's mind. "We can't stay," he told them, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "They'll send men from Charleston. They'll hang us all." 37 people had survived, men, women, and children, who had worked the fields and house of Ward Plantation. Some looked at the burning ruins with terror, others with fierce joy. All knew they stood at the edge of something unknown. An old woman named Martha spoke up, her voice cracking with age. "Where we go, boy? Ain't nowhere safe for us." Josiah pointed north, toward the river that cut through the plantation's edge. "Solomon always said, 'Follow the water. It leads to free land.'" "And what about him?" someone asked. "The giant?" Josiah stared toward the swamp where Solomon had disappeared. "He's got his own path now. Ours is that way." He gestured north again. "We take what food we can carry. We move fast. We stay together." They gathered what little they could: cornmeal from the storehouse, dried meat, a few tools that might be useful. Babies were wrapped tight against mothers' chests. The elderly leaned on sticks cut from tree branches. By mid-morning, they were moving along the riverbank, a ragged line of people seeking a freedom they could barely imagine. Josiah walked at the front, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. He had spent years sneaking around the plantation. Now those skills served a greater purpose. When they heard horses in the distance, he led them into thick brush until the danger passed. When they needed to cross open fields, they did so at night, under cloud cover. They slept during the hottest part of the day, hidden in woods and gullies. They moved at dawn and dusk when shadows were long and watching eyes fewer. Children learned to cry silently against their mother's shoulders. The old bit back groans when their joints ached. 2 nights into their journey, they came upon a small camp hidden in a dense thicket near the river. A man sat beside a tiny fire, so small it gave almost no light. He jumped to his feet when he heard them approach, knife in hand. "We ain't trouble," Josiah called softly. "Running same as you." The man was rail-thin, with scars across his back, visible through his torn shirt. "Ward Plantation?" he asked, recognizing their direction of travel. "Not anymore," Josiah answered. "It's ashes now." The man's eyes widened. He introduced himself as Daniel, a runaway from the Thornton estate, the neighboring plantation where Ruth had supposedly been sent. As they shared their meager food, Josiah finally asked the question that had been burning in his heart. "A woman named Ruth Reed. She was sold there about a week ago. Did you see her?" Daniel's face darkened. He stared into the tiny flames before answering. "I saw her. Strong woman. Kept her head high even when they tried to break her." "Where is she now?" Josiah asked, his heart racing. "Did she run too?" Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with sorrow. "She's with God now, boy. Refused to work. Kept saying her husband would come for her. Overseer had her flogged. She never made a sound, not even at the end." The world seemed to tilt beneath Josiah. He turned away from the others, walking a few paces into the darkness. Silent tears tracked down his face. Ruth had been like a mother to him after his own had died in the fields. Her kindness, her quiet strength, now gone. He thought of Solomon, walking into the swamp, hoping to find her. The truth would destroy him, turn his rage into something even darker. Or maybe he already knew. Maybe that's why he hadn't joined them in their flight north. Martha found him there, staring into the darkness. She placed a gnarled hand on his shoulder. "We keep going," she said simply. "For her. For all of them." The next morning, they continued their journey. Daniel joined them, guiding them along paths that slave hunters rarely checked. They crossed streams to hide their scent from dogs. They traveled parallel to old tracks, where sympathetic conductors might offer aid. Days blended into weeks. They lost 2 of the eldest to exhaustion. A baby was born beneath a lightning-struck oak, its first cries muffled against its grandmother's apron. They met others like themselves, refugees from a system that was beginning to crack beneath its own cruelty. Some continued north with them. Others split off toward different sanctuaries. Josiah led those who stayed with him, his body growing taller and stronger with each passing season. Seasons turned, and the boy became a man. 20 years later, Josiah Reed, for he had taken Solomon's surname as his own, stood before a small church in Georgia. His shoulders were broad now, his face lined with the wisdom of hard years. Behind him sat a congregation of free black men and women, their children fidgeting in Sunday clothes. "Today, I want to tell you about strength," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Not the strength of arms or back, though the man I speak of had plenty of both. I want to tell you about the strength that lives in here." He tapped his chest. "The kind that chains can't hold." His 5 grandchildren sat in the front row, eyes wide as he told them the story of Solomon Reed, the giant of Carolina. "He was big as a mountain," Josiah told them, stretching his arms wide. "But what made him truly giant was his heart. They tried to break him, you see. They used every tool of torment man has invented. But when the breaking came," he clapped his hands together sharply, making the children jump. "It wasn't the giant who broke. It was the chains that bound us all." That night, after the children were asleep, Josiah sat on his small porch. The moon cast long shadows across the yard. His eldest daughter brought him a cup of cider. "You never told me if he died that night," she said quietly. "The giant. Did he find peace?" Josiah sipped his cider, his eyes fixed on the tree line where the swamp began in the distance. "Some say he died of his wounds. Some say he made it north and lives free. Others believe he still walks the swamps of Carolina, helping others find their way." As he spoke, a shadow seemed to move between the distant trees, too large for a man, too purposeful for an animal. It was there for just a moment, then gone. "I think perhaps he became something more than man," Josiah said softly, smiling through tears that caught the moonlight. "A memory that walks, a hope with fists and fury. A story that can never be unwritten." His daughter squeezed his shoulder and went inside, leaving him to his memories and the night. Rain began to fall once more over Carolina, gentle at first, then heavier. It washed across plantation ruins and unmarked graves, across fields where blood and tears had fallen, across the ash that had once been chains and ledgers and whips. The water carried it all into the same soil that had birthed both bondage and its breaking. And in that soil, something grew that neither lash nor law could kill. The legend of the giant, the man who bent but never broke. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.